One major concern that has emerged from the September Nintendo Direct is the eye-watering price of the Super Mario Galaxy 1 plus 2 pack. This is a Switch 1 title and is only the second of its type to hit $70 for the original Switch. The first time was Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, and while that attracted opprobrium, there was also a set of mitigating circumstances. Not only was that Zelda title a huge game, unprecedented in terms of scope and scale for Nintendo, and with a very significant development time, more than 6 years, but also, more practically, it used a more memory-hungry game card, which was the immediate cause for the increased price. None of these things can be said of Super Mario Galaxy 1 plus 2. These are two older games that released a significant period ago, and while there are minor graphical fixes in place and a few extra storybook pages, there is no substantive addition to the core gameplay that would justify such a major escalation in price. In this video, therefore, I want to deep dive the whys and wherefores of Nintendo's pricing in this case, look at how this compares with a title like Hollow Knight Silksong, which for barely more than a quarter of the price offers a brand new experience in a hugely popular franchise, and consider the likely consequences, as well as thinking about the overall strategy that Nintendo is taking when it issues its prices such as this. As ever with these discussions, a word of caution. Figuring out an explanation for Nintendo's decisions is not the same as praising or condemning any particular pricing choices. I sometimes do opinion-focused videos, and I may even do an opinion video on pricing at some point, but fundamentally, what I want to do is to figure out what Nintendo's rationale is on the company's own terms. So in 2024, I examined Nintendo's pricing strategy in a lot of depth, and at that point, I pretty much identified, before Doug Bowser came in to discuss it himself, what is now termed their variable pricing strategy. I'll link to that video at the end, as I think it gives a fuller deep dive of the issues Nintendo are wrestling with here. But at that point, the two major games that were worth contrasting were Luigi's Mansion 2 HD, a 3DS port of a decent title with strong but not world-beating reviews, priced at $60, and Metroid Prime Remastered, which was a lavish restoration of one of the greatest games of all time, had clearly had a great deal of time and attention spent on it, and yet was booted out the door for two-thirds the sticker price of Luigi's Mansion 2. Now, I would say that Super Mario Galaxy 1 plus 2 fits very much into the slipstream of Luigi's Mansion 2 HD in terms of price, and I wouldn't even be completely astonished if the same team at Tantalus worked on getting it shined up at least to the extent that it has been renovated. Let's consider this from a few angles then. Firstly, the underlying economics are clear. Mario is a product with high demand, especially during a major anniversary and ahead of a massive movie tie-in. We can reasonably expect Galaxy 2 at least, and probably the double pack, to sell 10 million copies plus, given that the 3D All-Stars collection sold nearly 10 million as a limited edition game. Naturally, the higher the demand for something is, the more scope there is to increase the price. Now, there are other resistances that are in place for raising the price too, such as what the market will bear, but going up to the $70 price point, the absolute upper tramline of what Switch 1 games have ever cost, stays just about within that expected range. Keeping at $70 also avoids the complexity of having a Nintendo Switch 2 edition title as well. The game doesn't really have enough of an add-on exclusive to Switch 2 owners to justify two separate editions, and if they had tried to issue dual editions, then inevitably people would just have bought the Switch version instead of the Switch 2 one, so there was never a reality where they were going to have two different editions. Locking this to the Switch 2 standard pricing therefore does have its own logic. Now, Nintendo has a lot of experience at knowing the kinds of prices that people will pay. Is this massively outside the historic range of Nintendo's offerings? Well, in real terms, no, it's not. If it were released today, Super Mario 3D All-Stars would cost $75 and Breath of the Wild would cost $80. Of course, whenever I identify real-term prices, people reasonably note that people's ability to pay is different now compared to in the past, but people said the same about the Nintendo Switch 2, the Pokemon Scarlet and Violet games, Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, and about Mario Kart World, and all of those became huge sellers, which suggests that while it may feel more painful for the audience, Nintendo's judgment of what the market will, in fact, bear isn't too far off the mark. Now, of course, there are plenty of people who will respond to prices and potentially will dip out on these games as a result. But for $60 to be the better choice for Nintendo financially, the game would have to perform at least 16% better, and in fact significantly more than that, because that extra $10 is, apart from the retailer cut, pure profit for Nintendo and doesn't reflect any of the fixed costs that they would have to spend anyway, such as the cost of making the port in the first place. Are customers so price sensitive that a $10 dip would lead to a maybe 20% increase in sales or more in order to justify the lower price? Well, we can reasonably infer from statements Nintendo has given that Metroid Prime Remastered, priced a full $20 less than the standard at the time, hasn't or has only barely cracked 2 million sales, given that we know Metroid Dread is north of 3 million, and the company announced in late 2024 that Metroid games collectively shifted not quite 5 million on Switch by that point. And bear in mind that we know there's a core people who double dipped with the physical after buying the digital version straight out, so in many respects the absolute number of people owning that game might be even less than that. Now, perhaps you could say that Metroid Prime Remaster was doomed anyway, and it would have sold less than a million without the reduced price point. That's perfectly plausible, but it isn't an indication that there's some groundwell of gamers who are focusing primarily on price, and that's because the fact is, that is not a battle that Nintendo can win. Loads of AAA games are sold for really low prices. Even third-party Mario titles, such as Mario plus Rabbids, frequently descend to bargain basement prices pretty quickly. Sometimes this is out of desperation and sometimes for other reasons. Team Cherry can put out Hollow Knight Silksong for $20 because the core development staff is minuscule. With the original Hollow Knight selling more than 15 million copies, if we assume Silksong manages half the numbers than after platform fees, transaction costs, legal fees, and such like, they're still likely to be approaching 80, 90, 100 million US dollars in terms of revenue if they maintain that price. And that's before we talk about merchandising, licensing, and other sources of potential income from Hollow Knight. Each of the core members of the team are likely to be better remunerated from that game than even many of the upper echelon Nintendo creators would be in a lifetime. Now, that's not to say that they couldn't have increased the price and made more, but they can be perfectly comfortable offering a game at a price that undercuts most other titles of similar scope on the market, and if anything, the price attracted some criticism from indie game creators on far tighter margins, hoping to increase the expected price of the game. And yet, despite this, people will still buy Nintendo content, and notably, they will still buy Mario. Because here's where Galaxy 1 Plus 2 is different from Metroid Prime Remastered and different from Hollow Knight Silksong. It has the character of Mario, and Nintendo is exceptionally keen to ensure that they maintain the perception of value around that character. In a sense, they have a monopoly in a very specific market. Sure, if you want a generic video game mascot, then there's Sonic, Pac-Man, Astrobot, Bubsy, but if you want Mario specifically, Nintendo is the only company selling Mario stuff, and they are going to want to ensure that they are earning from the character. I also think there is a fundamentally different perception of the value of an older game in Nintendo compared with the industry at large and compared with the audience base. Nintendo has always gone down the route of full price ports. Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze is an example where the port was more expensive than the original title. But I think when they consider the development costs of games and the value being offered, they are also considering not just the day one sales, but the potential of these titles to continue selling indefinitely into the future. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is a great example of this, but there are more subtle examples as well. Consider Donkey Kong Country Returns. This was a significant development, and Retro Studios took about 3 years putting out the original Wii game. It sold decently, zoning in on 7 million copies. We don't necessarily have final numbers, but it was 6.53 million when last reported. Then the game was ported to 3DS, where it scooped another million or two, and then to Switch, where it scored another probably 2 million by now. Give or take, that game is a 10 million seller and has provided a consistent income for the company over a substantial period of time, about 15 years. What they didn't do was say, right, this game is now more than 4 years old, we better send it crashing into the bargain bin. For one thing, it would be an odd choice economically, as the game still sells. However, it would also convey that their games are designed for a short-term high rather than being forever titles that should be capable of entertaining people as much in year 10 and year 20 as day 1. That might have been the case more when video game technology was shifting rapidly, as with the jump from 2D to 3D in the dawn of the Nintendo 64 era, but these days that is a far harder case to make. Now, clearly, there is a limit to this, and we will see this with the growth of Nintendo Switch Online, where the classic apps are basically the retirement home for those Nintendo games that no longer are sold independently, but having a 20-plus year time horizon for the potential for their games to sell has a lot of advantages for the company, and, in an odd way, maybe for the players as well. For one thing, it changes the risk perception for any individual game in a way that other companies might not consider. No sane company cleaving to a spreadsheet-driven view of what makes financial sense to make next would keep putting major, high-effort Metroid games out. The franchise sales are mediocre at best, and because they're costly to make, the return on investment for many of these titles must be pretty derisory by the standards of other titles in Nintendo's library. But a title like Metroid Prime can still be earning at a tick 20, 30, 40 years later, and if Nintendo can find a way to have the franchise truly break out, as Zelda did with Breath of the Wild, or if due to some unforeseen social trend or situation things swing Metroid's way, as with Animal Crossing, there is a small but significant probability that not just this game, but the entire Metroid back catalogue could suddenly become far more valuable. That's why you hold a diversified portfolio of different titles in development at any time. Now, in order to justify investment in niche and experimental concepts, in order to be able to shrug off developers missing deadlines, you need to have at least a small number of titles that are able to sell hugely, the tentpole titles that hold up the tent. Super Mario Galaxy 2, let's face it, sold relatively poorly on the original Wii. Yes, it was a sequel in the later years of the Wii, but it's a hugely successful game and was compatible with current hardware for 7 years after its release, but it was a long way from the kind of numbers other Mario games have achieved, barely more than Super Mario Sunshine, which was the flagship game for the relatively underperforming GameCube. And yet, because they trust that a good game remains good long after its release, Nintendo can continue to make money off Galaxy 2 long after its original sales window. And part of the reason why this works is because many of the game's potential audience won't have been born when the original's released. For those crowds queuing outside the next Mario film, if you had a choice between playing a generic new Mario title or Galaxy 1 and Galaxy 2 as a double pack, you really couldn't get much better than the Galaxies in terms of gameplay, even if they are on the older side. I'm not saying Nintendo peaked with these games in terms of quality, just that maintaining that level of excellence is tricky. And if you're going to buy a double Mario pack and care only about maximizing the quality of the experience you get, this double pack actually does make sense. It's also important for Nintendo that they don't scupper their other games by underpricing one and therefore potentially encouraging people to buy Galaxy 1 plus 2 as opposed to trying a wider variety of Mario titles. If they had put the double pack at $50, for example, people new to Mario games might also have come away with the impression that this is the standard price for Mario games and games in the series, and then would have had a sticker shock of their own once the newer games come out. It's far easier to anchor prices at the start of a sales relationship than it is to change people's perceptions of what games air quote, should cost thereafter. There's also something about Mario, which is that they really don't like remaking Mario games. This isn't the case with, for example, Zelda. Link's Awakening has had 3 versions, but almost every major game that's been around long enough in the Zelda series has had a new version of some description. If the original game is strong enough, they might go with a plus game approach, see Four Swords being stapled onto the Game Boy Advance version of Zelda A Link to the Past, but with occasional exceptions such as Super Mario 64 DS, we don't tend to see the same kind of tinkering with older titles in the Mario universe, with Miyamoto being quoted in 2017 as saying, "I don't really feel like I want to remake any of them. It's more natural to always create new mechanics and new games." But new mechanics are vastly risky. Your new console could be the next Switch or the next Wii U. Your next game could be the next universally beloved Mario Galaxy, or the next, more controversial, Super Mario Sunshine. The temptation for a company like Nintendo is always to go back and iterate on previous triumphs, and I don't think they're averse to doing that. But fundamentally, they need the leeway to try the new and different thing, and to do that, they need to ensure the core value of the entire Mario line is held up, and not be dependent on the dice roll of their newest title to keep them afloat. A final consideration is the fact that there are 2 games. Frankly, by Nintendo standards, and I do emphasize by Nintendo standards as I say this, $70 for 2 of the best regarded Wii games is less egregious than $60 for Donkey Kong Returns HD, a well regarded but still individual game. Objectively, if I were to guess which out of the 3 were $60 and which were $40, I would guess Galaxy 2 would have the higher price point than Donkey Kong Country Returns. But it doesn't, because they clearly realise that pushing these 2 Galaxy titles out as separate games would be a bit of a stretch, and I think they really do want players new to the Mario universe to have a good, lasting experience with these games. Ultimately, I think it's unlikely that Nintendo will back away from pricing titles such as this quite highly in the future, but games outside the Mario branding may still retain relatively lower price points for a while yet, especially in franchises they still want to build the audience of, such as Donkey Kong and Metroid. Of course, if you want to drill down much more into the mechanics of the decisions behind Nintendo's broader pricing strategy, this video on screen has you covered, and I would also recommend checking it out. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.